In this instructor development session, I'm going to be talking about a plumb line. And a plumb line, for those that have never heard of this term, it dates back at least as far back as the ancient Egyptians. And it's just, a plumb line is essentially a weighted line which helps you determine if something is straight up and down, if it's vertical. If, in modern days, typically people will use a level, but even some like city workers, contract workers that put in things like telephone poles, utility poles, will still use just a leaded weight and a line, a string, and stick it up as high as they are on the pole. If the pole is crooked, the line's not going to be plumb. So we're going to use that as instructor development to kind of look at stances, and this is going to be a way for you to better understand the differences in my stance versus your stance versus a student's stance. In instructor development, we have to take into account things about our student's body. Not all people are the same height, same width, same weight, same inseam, all of those things. If you think about the differences in the human body, they're vast. So you may have two students that are 5'7", and one of them has a 30-inch inseam, another has a 28-inch inseam. So their legs are longer compared to their body than the other person. There's all of these different variables that go into play. Even identical twins, if maybe you get identical twins at age 6 in your dojo, and those you're probably not going to fine tune like I'm talking about here, but if you get identical twins that are in their 30s or 40s, they've gone through vast life changes. They're not eating the same food every day like they probably did when they were kids. So they're going to have different body weights. They're going to have different scars, different issues that have happened to them in their life. Every human is a little bit different. And as an instructor in this development portion, we want you to start thinking about that. And I'm going to talk about the plumb line in regards to stances. There are certain people out there that I'm going to do what we call saison stance, forward stance. So with my particular body type, I'm probably down to probably 5'6" or so now, shrinking a little bit in my older age. My inseam used to be about 30. I'm noticing now I wear about size 28 inseam pants. So I end up, this is a 2 foot by 2 foot square, I end up in saison stance. I feel most comfortable in basically inside that box. Obviously somebody that's 6'3" and has a 34-inch inseam, they're going to be a little bit wider with their stance. So be very careful as an instructor about telling everybody, yeah, saison stance is 2 by 2. Now, maybe your saison stance is 2 by 2, but you got to look at their body types. So typically in our saison stance, we're trying to get our chest square, and my saison stance, where my knees are bent, they're slightly flexed, I'm inside this 2 by 2 square, but my front heel is just maybe a centimeter outside of the pinky toe in relation to the square line. And same back here. If I let my heel come in, my chest starts changing. My chest starts to turn. That's Ka Hanshin, Jo Hanshin, upper body controls bottom body controls upper body. And so in this case, my heel coming in, if I just move it in, right about there is an inch, I've already, if my knees are flexed, I can't see my toes because my knees are over my toes, I've already turned almost 45 degrees from the straight line. Just moving, again, about an inch just to where my heel is just barely outside of that line, outside of my pinky toe. I'm still flexed. I'm straight with the camera in this case. Now, plumb line, if you imagine, and this, I'm just going to use a metal bob at the end of a chain. That's my plumb line. That's what I'm talking about. So if you imagine where that would be coming out spine-wise, and yeah, I know it looks kind of funny, but I'm trying to get, essentially in this stance, it's weighted, it's a forward stance is what we usually call it. So I'm pushing my weight, I'm flexing my legs, and that plumb line comes a little forward. If I do this a little bit more from a side view for you, if my knees are behind my toes, I can actually see my toes, then my plumb line's about center. But I'm pushing my weight until it's a little bit forward of that center line. That's something you want to look at as you're trying to get your students to get into the particular stance. It's a forward stance, so my plumb should be a little bit forward, and I am, because of the nature of the stance, I am somewhat centered. Now, as I start to bring that heel in, you'll see I drift towards the side that the forward leg is on. So my forward leg is left. In addition to my chest changing, I went from a centered line to a left plumb. I've gone off of plumb. Here I'm plumb with my heel out, my chest center. I am pretty much centered plumb. Now, as I start to kind of go here, and I'm actually changing into kind of a horse stance, but because the front leg was glued to the ground, that shifted my plumb to the left of that line. And if you look at my box here, I've got edge to corner about 4 inches, and over here I've only got about an inch, inch and a half. So my plumb line should adjust. All right, so that's a forward stance. Our typical back stance, our back weighted stance, we have our foot in a 45-degree line, 45 to the north-south. All right, so my plumb line, if I set that back where it would be coming down my spine, typically I have about a 80-20 spread of where the plumb line lands. All right, so it's landing somewhere about there. So 45 degrees here. Now I will tell you, the angle of my shoulders is about 45 degrees. If I go perfect, I'm aiming my big toe towards that opposite side of the southwest box there. On this side, that's my foot is a perfect 45. This angle and the perfect 45 on this angle are slightly different. So why is that? My body, I have, my right pelvis is canted in more than my left. So I have to make adjustments. My right foot, when I'm in a right back stance, is not exactly 45. My left is almost exactly 45. So for me, because of the way I was born, this is a little bit different. Instead, if I am at a perfect 45 here, my top chest is not at a 45. But on this one, I'm at a 45, my chest is at a 45. So my hip changes a little bit. So as an instructor, you should be looking for things like that and know that my heel, I'm going to make it a tiny adjustment to get my chest at a 45. But back stance, in general, from the side here, I'm in this position. If my plumb line comes out basically where my spine is, I'm back. It's about 80% back, somewhere in that ballpark. And then if I go into a cat, now maybe 85 to 90, I've shifted the plumb line further back when I take the weight off that front leg. when we talk about horse stance, so typically I'm somewhere in the ballpark of 2 feet wide. I know used to, back when I first started this, what we called our horse stance, which I think was probably leftovers from some of the other styles more, like people that came in from, like my original instructor in Ruku Kempo came from Shito-Ryu, so we were really wide, our heels were in. But Taika shallowed that up to where I'm roughly just maybe a little bit past the 2 foot mark. So 2 foot 1 inch, 1 inch, 2 foot 2 inch is where I'm pretty comfortable in the horse stance. Now, in regard to that, you also notice, just like that back stance, the back of my foot is coming out until it just barely passes that pinky toe. If I relax and flex my knees are over my toes, I cannot see them. If I keep that relaxed and keep my knees over my toes, that starts pushing me forward. If I let my heels go farther back, my weight starts shifting back. And so with the plumb line, that is pretty easy to see. If I'm right here on this, if I get all in the stance and I'm holding that plumb line, if I rock my heels forward, you see I come north of plumb. All right, so if I divided that up, it's probably from the plumb line to the 1 foot mark. I've come about 25–30% of that just right there by pushing those heels forward. It pushes my body forward and creates a kind of a lean or a fall situation. And Taika used that. A lot of the times he would say commit. So I'm in a forward stance and I want to do my C step. He would throw our heels in, which committed us to forward motion. All right, so again, I'll set this to where it stops swinging. I'm here, I drop down, gotta adjust that a little bit to where I can get into the stance. Now my knees are forward of my toes, so I cannot see my toes. I'm flexed but relaxed. My heels are slightly outside, and I'm pretty much spot on dead center. My feet are pretty much centered on that middle line, and then when I get my stance correct, the plumb line is centered, right? And it stops rocking. As the heels come in, it goes forward. As heels go out, it goes back. All right? So if I go back center again, if I just do my right heel, and essentially what I'm doing is I'm turning into a back stance. I move the plumb line. If I go back to my horse stance, move the other foot to where I end up in a back stance, the plumb line moves back. That's predominantly what you're looking for as an instructor. You're trying to figure out if they are plumb where they should be plumb, right? Forward stance, plumb line should be forward. Back stance, plumb line should be back. Any neutral kind of stance, whether it's natural, what we call natural stance, ready stance, natural stance, horse stance, then that plumb line should be somewhere pretty close to center. Obviously, a slight difference. Natural stance is heels in. Okay, stop it from swinging. If I go heels out, that changes, right? As I go heels out, I drift a little bit back. I have to stop the swing, but you get the kind of picture. As my heels come in, I'm a little bit forward. All right, so what we are looking for with students is that the plumb line is where it should be. As an example of somebody not having it where they should be, if I am in my back stance, So I'm using my 2x2 box here. I'm in a back stance, so obviously my plumb line should be back if it's coming out of my spine. If my back stance is here, then I'm in front of that line. Obviously it's not a back stance, it's a forward stance, and probably not correct, unless I specifically have a stance in the art that I'm in that is forward leaning, which we kind of have that when we do our Bokken Renshu Daiichi, where we're coming forward, kind of in a reverse cat stance, reverse cat. So, but reverse cat would be a forward weighted stance. If they're calling it a back stance and the plumb line is forward, then something's off there. In addition to, like I talked about, my hip being, my pelvis slightly being turned in on the right side, there are other factors to think about. So when you're 15, 16 years old and you've got 0% body fat, you may dial in all your stances, that's when you learn them, but realize as time progresses, as a student progresses through their time in the martial arts, things are going to change. Very common thing for men is we put on a lot of weight right in the belly. It may not look like I have that much, but I have 15 more pounds, and most of it's in this area, than I did when I was 16. I had abs of steel, now I have abs of steel wool. So thinking about that, 15 pounds at the belly, that's 15 pounds. If my horse stance, if I get in a horse stance and this is where I'm normally at 0% body fat, young teenager, and then I add 15 pounds here, that puts my plumb line forward. Definitely puts my plumb line forward. So how do I have to correct for that? My heels got to start creeping out. My heels got to start creeping out. Conversely, you could bring your toes in, but then your stance starts getting really a little bit probably too narrow. Again, every person has to figure out what works best for them. But just eating barbecue 3-4 times a week, 15 pounds right there in that general area, that's going to change your plumb line. I'm going to try setting this on the 45 again as I'm talking and trying to hold this plumb line, my chain and weight, the plumb bob sitting there. It's kind of hard to do this without a lot of movement. But the concept, here I am at a 45, you can kind of see it a little bit better than when I was straight on. So if I go forward, I'm going to head that way and back that way. So if my knees are bent, I'm flexed, I'm relaxed, my plumb line is centered, my feet are centered on the 45, my back is somewhat straight as I can without looking down at my plumb line to kind of explain what I'm doing here. That's a good horse stance. My knees are in front of my toes. If I look down without bending over, if I look down, I can't see my toes. That's where I want to be. Plumb is center. Now, 3 pulled pork sandwiches a week. I put on 15 pounds to my belly. All right, and so that on the belly, as it drops down, that's added about 3 inches front body weight. As far as my feet didn't move. My feet didn't move at all, but I'm trying to do my stance still, and now I've got 15 more pounds on the front of me. All right, that's not 15 pounds is not an unrealistic belly weight for somebody in their, somebody that used to be pretty fit as a teenager or as in their 20s, now they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s. It's not unusual, all right? So that is putting the plumb forward. So how do you correct it? If I go in, I'm going to go further forward. If I go just a little bit out, I just bring my heels maybe a ½ inch out, depending on all the variables of height and inseam and all that stuff. Then I return to the plumb line. As an instructor, you've got to think about your students in other ways. Men typically put weight here. If you have young women or young teen girls in your dojo that start getting a little bit more chesty, that's putting more weight on the front and higher up. All right, so here again, I've got more weight going this way. I'm more likely to start leaning and have to adjust my stance. So doesn't matter if you're chesty or you got the big belly, as things change in your body, you have to change your stances. If you just tell your students that they have to be exactly 45 and this exactly straight, it's not going to work for everybody. As you're playing with these experiments, be very careful that you don't artificially force yourself to stay in the same spot. And by that I mean, if I'm trying to look at my plumb line to where I'm central, I'm centered here in a horse stance, I have my knees forward, my spine is pretty much straight, and I'm centered. There's going to be people that have told me that, well, I can turn my heels in and that doesn't change. Well, I'll tell you, when I just did that to where it didn't change, I feel a lot of tightness in my body. So I feel my legs getting tight because I'm compensating in a weird and unnatural way. I can pull my heels in and not fall forward, but I've really got to like tighten glutes, tighten legs, and do things in an unnatural way. If I get in this stance, relaxed, flexed legs, and turn my heels in, I should naturally feel like I'm going forward. Heels out, I should naturally feel that I'm going back. So you should be able to do that and feel that change. If you're not feeling the change, then you are artificially, you're not relaxed now. Again, I'm staying relaxed through the course of this experiment to find and dial in where my stance should be. There are certain times in stances where things are tightening and loosening. I'm gripping the floor in various ways. I'm doing a lot of different things more at an advanced level, but when you're trying to dial in a student and find where that natural balance is, you want them completely relaxed. All right? I can do all sorts of other things with my knees and everything, but I'm trying to keep my knee is in this position. I'm not artificially driving those knees out or bringing them in. I'm not flexing my calves. I'm not flexing my glutes. I'm trying to relax and dial in and feel where I'm naturally plumb in a neutral stance, such as a horse stance.